Everyone's time. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the CPRA Ad Hoc. My name is Kareli Ordaz, and I'm chairing this meeting for today. We have these wonderful folks on screen who are joining us. I want to start by sharing an agenda and then starting the conversation. So please let me know if you're able to see my screen. Can you see that okay? Yeah. Okay, awesome. And I sent this earlier today. Apologies for not sending it last week on Friday as promised. It got a little hectic on my end, but for the agenda, we want to get situated on the ad hoc. We have not met in a long time, and the scope was slightly different. So I think it's important to get on the same page about what this work is. And also membership moving forward, as I am leaving, and my last day is June 30th of this year. We need to make sure that we are as prepared as possible for that transition. Then want to spend the majority of the time talking about the Manual of Operations, or SOPs, as we previously called them, and then talk about the annual report and take any public comments if there's anyone joining us today, which I'm not sure there is, but perhaps there might be. How does this agenda sound to you all, and is there anything missing?
Sounds good here. Not seeing anything missing.
Okay.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other. I think you all have this, otherwise I will share it with you, but starting off with our ad hoc purpose and goals. Micah, I think, and I did not ask you for this ahead of time, but we have this already drafted, right? Maybe we can start there with where we landed.
The ad hoc, one more time, sorry.
The ad hoc description?
Yeah, give me a sec.
I'm also looking for it. Let's see who finds it first. Ad hoc committees. I have it actually here. And I'll share my screen. Yeah,
Okay.
you have it?
Yeah, I have it. Let me pull it up. Let's see. CPRA, boom, boom. There we are. Right here. Okay, can you see right here? Let me make that big.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I think for those of you who were not here, I think, yeah, Roger, you were not here. Ricardo, or Commissioner Garcia Acosta, you were not here. Director Muir, I'm not sure if you were here when the CPRA manual or SOPs met last time, or where that work landed. Were you here when that happened?
No, I was not. Although I've watched some of the meetings. I think hopefully all of them.
Yeah. So the goal was really focused on the SOPs at the time. I think a question for us to consider here is whether we want to keep the scope the same and the purpose to just really focus on now what we're calling the Manual of Operations, or if this committee should be a little broader to include more, a CPRA comprehensive view on the work. And I guess as I'm speaking, I think it would be helpful to maybe hear from you, Director Muir, as to what would be the most helpful to your work as well. And then hear from commissioners and of course, Roger, and also hear from our commissioners to see what would be helpful in terms of the scope of this ad hoc.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I think if we zoom out, and I apologize because this is based on a memory of the watching recordings, but my understanding is that the basis for the original convening of this particular ad hoc was the creation of standard operating procedures as recommended by the Inspector General's office. Is that correct?
Yes.
Understood. And I think that maybe it'll be easier to define the scope going forward at the end of this meeting than the beginning, because we can just talk through what exists, what the plans are. We can talk about the annual report and sort of look at where we see potential gaps and certainly opportunities for additional feedback. But in a broad sense, what we want to ensure is that the manual of operations clearly conveys the investigative process for our agency, the ways in which community members can reach our agency, the goals and values of the agency, and ensures that we have healthy due process for the officers, that we have healthy due process for our own staff, and that the agency's work is reflecting community values. So whatever the scope is, that's certainly my goal at each juncture. And I think that we can have a collaborative conversation around what the best avenues for entry are on that front.
Thank you. Others? Okay, yeah.
One area that does jump to mind for future consideration, to the extent, and I know it's not entirely in line with what we're going to discuss today, but that's already here, is that to the extent there can be policies or practices around outreach, if we would like for this particular ad hoc, or if you all feel that this ad hoc is an appropriate space for that, we would certainly appreciate that being a feedback loop where we can have conversations on that front. So just throwing that out there as we're brainstorming here.
Yeah, thank you, Director Mira. Actually, I was reaching for my notes right now because that's actually one thing I did highlight that I'd like to see in terms of a section within the manual is really being intentional around outreach, community engagement, and how that ties down to some of CPRA's principles, especially as it pertains to, you know, just the follow-up and how that relentless outreach is going to look in terms of keeping families in the loop at all times, regardless of the outcomes of these cases. And so really just having a section that really details what that looks like and those standard practices are going to take place as it pertains to community engagement.
That's helpful. And I know we're kind of diving into the manual of operations, so we'll have a deeper discussion when we get to that point. But to kind of address what you just mentioned, Commissioner, I wonder if maybe, you know, we talk about the outreach within the manual of operations. I wonder if it needs to be its own policy, and that conversation happens here, having the policy for the CPRA as a whole, and then we can make a recommendation to the full body if, you know, we come to a space where we all agree. So kind of zooming out outside of just the manual itself, but policy, CPRA policy.
I think that'd be fantastic.
Great.
If I might throw one other category out there. So over the past, I'll say approximately 3 months, we got council approval to get a grant for our agency for $250,000 toward our mediation program. There are so that has been drafted. There are still some crucial questions to be answered in terms of which cases are eligible for mediation. I'm still doing having conversations around ways and ensure we make sure this does not impact OPD procedures or CPRA procedures negatively, and that there's a healthy workflow. But I think this may be the best forum to get feedback for that process to ensure that it what we've been doing and what community boards has been doing is researching oversight entities around the country, figuring out sort of what questions are answered differently in different jurisdictions for a mediation program, and then speaking to members of the community here about what they're seeking from a mediation program. And in doing so, there'll just, again, be a few junctures where perhaps the commission will be the best feedback point for how to approach issues going forward. So just putting that out for future ideas.
Awesome. That's great. Any other thoughts on sort of the scope of this ad hoc? Okay. And I agree with your comment, Mac, that at the end of the meeting, we'll have more clarity about what the purpose of this space is going to be. So I'm also holding space for that as we move the conversation along. I think the other big thing for me that I think is important for us to get on the same page about is the community engagement aspect of this, and I should say the community members who are part of this body. Figuring out how to best work with them. They were really all in on the manual of operations. There was a little bit of dynamics there that may have to watch the last meeting to see where things left, and also connect with them to make sure that they feel like they've been heard in this process. But I wanted just to lift up one, that we should think about how to engage the community, and also see if folks have any thoughts here around how do we keep that door open, especially also added capacity for this work moving forward.
Absolutely. I'm not remembering if you're referring to a specific thing in the last meeting, but I would certainly love to continue to engage those folks, as I know there's been a lot of time and energy there, and make sure that anybody who participates in an ad hoc sees that as an opportunity to come back at any given time.
Yeah, I'm not talking about a specific incident or anything, but just in general, I think we were in different times, and it's important to bring folks along as we move forward together more intentionally and more focused and aligned. The final piece before we step into that manual is sort of the leadership of this body. Commissioner, you're the only one here outside of me, but I just wanted to lift this up, and I'll also share this with our colleague. We will need someone to step into this role as I am stepping back. So we don't have to talk about that here. Obviously, we need to talk to our chair as well, especially as we have a new commissioner coming on board. But I wanted to just put it out there so we're on the same page. Next, I want to move us forward on the manual. So I think it would be helpful, Director Muir, to maybe ground us on where we are now, where I know you've given us updates at commission meetings, sort of if you can remind us where your last update was, and then we can start the dialogue. And there are some questions that were part of the agenda that I can reference as the conversation moves along.
Fantastic. Yeah, so the arc of this process has been ensuring that our manual is something that's a really valuable reference guide for each investigator on staff, for each staff member, and that they're able to go to that and feel really grounded in using that as a resource that ultimately lessens the supervisory burden to a certain extent, but also ensures that best practices are being referred back to on a regular basis, are easily grasped by the investigators, and that there's one place for investigators to go to on that matter. So what I've certainly seen over the time that I've been here is that there are a lot of training materials, that there are a lot of reference documents at the agency, and that they're scattered in a lot of different places, and that some of them were memorialized in aspects of the SOPs, some of them were not. And what we're doing here is essentially taking a holistic approach of what is existing practice that works, what are elements that we understand need to be incorporated into this manual, what are the best practices nationally for just investigative processes, and how do we weave that into a document where section by section you can refer back to it in an accessible manner. So what we've been doing, and Chief Smith, I'm going to pass it to you. I don't know if we want to pull up the actual table of contents in terms of the approach here, but we've been working on an August 2nd deadline to ensure that there is a complete draft available for the commission. What we've been in the process of doing that, we've divided up different categories of material that needs to be addressed in the manual. And we'd like to have a conversation about each of those sections. Of course, the reference document, we've got our internal documents, there are the SOPs, and Chief Smith's certainly aware and has gone through all those and has dissected them and sorted them in a meaningful way that I'm going to let him speak to. But the goal is to consolidate it all, get that legal review in a way where we're really comfortable with the product that we're providing to you as an ad hoc or to the full commission, depending, I think, on your decisions on how that would proceed. And then when we have that to you, our goal is to be able to say, great, this is the product that we think is going to be successful going forward. And now we're ready for your feedback on anything that needs to be added or removed, etc. What I would say to that is hopefully this conversation can be a point where we really ensure that all of the topics that come up here are incorporated in a meaningful way. And Chief Smith can speak to sort of the logistics of incorporating staff feedback, legal feedback, supervisory feedback to make sure that we don't have any of the issues that we had with Local 21 and with the SOPs, that essentially we have the staff buy-in at this stage. And I think we've done a lot of the legwork to ensure that they're aware of what's going to be in here, that they're comfortable with, to the extent appropriate, with the guidelines that are going to be going forward. And also that we know that from a due process perspective, that this is not going to have a negative impact on any of our investigations, that it's going to be making things move more efficiently and effectively at every juncture, and make sure that it takes a little less time. I think the real goal of this is that when new staff joins the agency, we can hand them this document and say, this is going to be your reference guide. This is your first few weeks, is really understanding this material and then circling back and having additional trainings that are built on it. And I noticed that that was in the agenda. And I think Chief Smith is also going to be speaking to some of the training process in the future. That's why it's divided up in the way it is, to where we can have a curriculum that revolves around essentially training, updating, retraining the manual on a regular basis, that make sure everyone's up to speeds, and that we don't have some investigators who have been around longer who have different practices than one who's been around for 6 months.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mac. I think that introduces in a very good way the purpose of the manual. I would like to say, in reference to some of the things that came up earlier in the conversation, that the process of creating this manual will very much feed the things that came up before. So this will very much facilitate bringing in the community stakeholders and helping them to understand our processes better as well, and creating an avenue by which they can provide feedback and raise questions about things they may not necessarily understand about the process generally. It also is something that will facilitate community engagement. Specifically, we'll be creating a unified way for all staff and for all stakeholders who come in contact with this manual to understand what's happening at CPRA. Yeah. And right now, with respect to some of the items in the manual, this is what we have now. Yeah. There are many sources of information within CPRA, within the information pool. There are trainings that have taken place. There is input that staff
I'm sorry, Chief Smith, 1 second.
Sure.
Micah, could you go on mute? I think she's away from I texted her as well. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Oh, no problem. There's been many sources of input that have brought us to this point in the process. One of those big sources has been the trainings that have taken place of staff in the past. Another big source of input has been the various supervisors that staff has had along the way. We're at a unique point in terms of the need of the agency, from the standpoint that the vast majority of staff that we have now are relatively new. So what that's created is the need to essentially draw together a unifying mission of how the agency goes about its tasks, and to get that in a form where, as Max said, all staff can see it. So a couple of key points as to where this process began. So there was a document that was generated under the supervision of the ad hoc committee last year. And that document has been as good a starting point as you could possibly have for this operation, which is essentially taking that document, identifying the points where additional information and clarity is needed for staff, incorporating the clarifying information, obtaining input from staff as to how the clarifying information and the existing information as expressed through the committee previously, how that information all hits the current practice of the agency, and then have all of that reflected in the manual going forward, and to ensure in the process of its creation that the things that are committed to print in the manual both accurately reflect where agency practices stand now, express what we aspire to be agency practice going forward, and factor in and take into account all of the legal responsibilities that we have as an agency, and to make sure that we're describing the legal end of the process as it relates to CPRA practice accurately as well. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, the entire exercise. But the accomplishment of that exercise and the process of getting it done also informs the issues that came up earlier in the conversation. It will greatly inform community outreach. It will greatly inform incorporating community stakeholder practice, and it will crystallize for the committee the things that the committee will want us to speak to more going forward. Because in addition to getting this into print, we also want it to be a living document that has an opportunity to develop as the agency's process grows.
Chair, I'm wondering if it might be a useful reference point at this time to turn over to the table of contents and have a little bit of a conversation, perhaps Q&A type session around some of those sections. Allow Chief Smith to speak to his approach to some of those sections and what we're aiming to get out of them.
Yeah.
And I do not know if Micah is the only one who can share their screen at this time.
That shouldn't be
Can
the
you-
case. Have you tried to share? Let's see here. Commissioner.
I can share.
Fox is
So,
able to.
Chief, can you try? Or Mac?
Mac, are you able to bring it up?
Yeah, just one moment. I'll just have it in the Word form here. Is everyone able to see my screen on the table of contents here?
Yes.
Fantastic. So
Can you zoom in a little bit, please?
yes, and I will make sure this matches the Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So I know that I can certainly speak to aspects of this, but from a broader organizational perspective, Chief Smith, if you'd like to just talk about the approach broadly and how that reflects aspects of the SOPs and the accessibility to staff and to the public, and then I'll chime in as necessary and can certainly answer questions on this.
Absolutely. So the committee should recognize the first 4 sections immediately. They are virtually identical to the pre-existing sections that existed in the document that was produced for the committee last year. The next part of it, so beginning in section 5, initially this was described as a complaint process. And this was a section that we identified in discussions as one that we wanted to right away make as community accessible and understandable as we possibly could. So instead of framing that as the complaint process writ large, we broke that down into the frequently asked questions which come up there. And we have 10 listed here, but we are through community feedback, through our discussions with this committee, and through our staff discussions, identifying as many of these frequently asked questions as we possibly can. The ones that are included here now are 10 of the most critical of those questions, things that we want to make sure we absolutely communicate to every complainant that might come through our doors. And we want to make sure that our community stakeholders understand that we are communicating this information. So that's what's involved in Section 5.
And critically, I might add that we want to ensure that every staff member has the answer to these questions very quickly when they're on board, so that anytime those questions are posed to them, they know them, and that's agency lore, that we have very clear answers that are consistent from member to member.
I think it's also important here to, especially with the community members who are part of this ad hoc, to have a conversation about what the answers to these questions look like, and are there opportunities for us to improve our process in terms of how, for example, the community makes a complaint. So I think, yes, this is helpful, and I think will provide a lot of clarity and consistency across the board. And we should also be open to adjusting any policies or processes to make this a much smoother effort from the community perspective. One question before you go deeper, Chief Smith. Did I hear you correctly that section 1 through 5 are complete?
No, I was
Because they're the same
describing
as is in
sort
the
of the
SOPs?
layout, sections 1 through 4 as being sections that should be familiar to the committee, in the sense that these are sections that existed in the previous version of this. The sections afterwards are the ones that are even modified in terms of how they would appear in the table of contents.
Got it. It would be helpful if we can go deeper, considering we don't have the actual content to review, for you all to tell us where you are, focusing your energy. I understand you're still working on these sections. And it would be helpful also, I think, to have clarity around, we said August 1st. I forget why we set that deadline. So if you all could remind us as to why, and the only reason why I bring that up is, one, because we need to get this done. And there's been a need to have these in place sooner than later. So I know we've been working on them for some time. Curious about, so it's kind of a double question, or more than 2 questions included in that.
I can certainly speak to the timeline, which I know we discussed in early January, if I remember correctly, which was part of this was Chief Smith, who has created manuals in other jurisdictions before, came on board in what I believe was the last week of February. So we had a time frame for him to become acquainted with all of our current practices as he's gone through the vast array of materials that we have internally, and then spoken to the stakeholders, spoken to our own staff about what is the current practice. Our goal is that, the moment that this is implemented, that it's not going to be a monumental shift in the day-to-day agency practice. It's going to be a monumental shift in the transparency of the agency and creating a solid framework for future change. But that this has taken the understanding of current practice, certainly post-triage system, and that it's taken the feedback of our own in-house counsel or outside counsel, and bearing in mind the various timelines for attorney review and for staff feedback as well. I know that Local 21's certainly pushed for a certain amount of time to be able to get feedback. Our own staff is really engaged. They want this to happen, and they want to make sure that they have the opportunity to provide feedback internally to Chief Smith. And so the August, as we laid out sort of the timeframes that were possible for this, August, I know I've said August 1st before, I believe that's a Thursday, on the draft timeline that I sent over to you in the chair. It was August 2nd. I've since seen that. But that was the amount of time that made sense when we checked in for feedback on how long it would take people to get back to us in a meaningful way.
Thank you for that. I think with that timeline, you know, the committee is probably not going to have capacity to have this final, you know, final review, you know, maybe by the end of this year at the latest. Is that, I mean, and that's where the concern is coming from. You know, if we wait, the community members are going to want to go through the sections, and I think we should go through each section to understand and make sure everyone's on the same page, and all of that is going to take some time.
Certainly, I think our goal is to get you a product that is accessible, is exciting, and can be usable immediately. And certainly after those layers of legal review, I think that that's something that internally maybe we can have further discussion about sort of what it means to implement this. But I hear you on that issue in terms of timeline, and I think that may be just subject to the ad hoc's timing going forward, or the commission's, depending on who is actually going to be doing that review on the commission end.
Can we go through each section and maybe walk us through, maybe if you can give us a percentage of like how far you are along in completing that section? It would give me a better understanding as to where this document is, how much is needed, and then, you know, how do we move forward?
That's fine. I have no problem going through and discussing generally the state of affairs with respect to each section. One thing that's important to add to what Director Muir has already mentioned, the process from my standpoint is actually two processes. I arrived, my first day here in the office was March 4th. And so the first thing I had to do was learn how the agency does things and learn that from all of the available sources. There was, to a certain extent, a bit of a trial by fire. We had some prominent hearings and cases that we were working on and ultimately decided in March and April. So I got to see things that way. And then in addition to that, during that time, learning of and having an opportunity to digest the internal documents, both reflective of prior trainings, as well as the sources of information that investigators were drawing from. So much of the process of getting us to today has really been that, and getting the things that we identify, as well as the document we were creating, to reflect all those different sources of input. So that's been a lot of it. It is critical to not rush this, but it's equally critical to have the initial document that we create be a working document that we are refining and developing and incorporating input from, that's going to ultimately then perfect the document. So it really, that date was chosen as a balance of that process, reflecting the urgency of getting a document as soon as possible, but at the same time, giving the document an opportunity to develop in a way that makes that initial document we create reliable as a base to then grow from and develop from. So to the extent that we're, this date that was ultimately chosen is one that wasn't necessarily the earliest one we can create. I think that was done with a view towards making sure that when we spoke, we were speaking accurately, and we were speaking in a way that remains open, as you described, Madam Chair, remains open to the input that is sure to come and makes that input as easy to incorporate as we can make it. And so now a little bit more about the content. So the frequently asked questions, those are questions that lend themselves to very narrow and specific answers. It's designed to be public friendly because these are questions that the public is really going to need the answer to, and they're going to need something easily understandable and something that actually helps them to engage the CPRA process. So this section of frequently asked questions, we anticipate that the completion of that will be the shortest. In fact, if we want to say from a percentage standpoint, how close we are to finish with that, we're more than 80% finished. It's just a question of making sure that the information that we plan to provide is consistent with the legal sources that would govern some of this information. For example, a legally sensitive piece of information that comes up in the frequently answered questions is exactly what we would communicate in response to I beyond the obvious initial answer to question I here. Will making a complaint against an officer affect my immigration status? The answer to that point blank is no. But in addition to that, there is information that we want them to know that reassures them that in no way can immigration status ever come up in any process whereby they would consider making a complaint. And perhaps, and this is a subject for discussion as well, also make sure people understand that as they access services generally, this is not something that can come up in the accessing of services that any person amongst the Oakland community might access. So this is an example of a way where we want to have the most communicative answer that we can provide legally. And that's what will be a thing that affects ultimately the information that's provided in response to these questions and others. So that's just one example. And now, Director Muir, if you can scroll down just a little bit. Okay, so complaint intake and investigation. We have this process here as one large section because the process by which complaints are received and by which they're investigated, we do have separate units. We do have a separate intake unit and investigations unit. But that process is one large process, and we want to make sure that the document we create speaks to it as one continuous large process. From the standpoint of content, what we've included to this point reflects key steps that are taken at each point. But the question is, how much do we want to communicate with respect to timetables for a lot of the steps that are described in this process? And the timetables in certain situations are a mixed question of law and fact. Sometimes you will have timetables that are controlled legally, and then you have other timetables which will be governed by what is the best agency practice. And so identifying and making sure we make the appropriate distinctions everywhere between those two things is the big focus of this section. But there is, from the standpoint of what the actual steps are, we're close to 80% finished with this, pending staff input and pending legal input to make sure that the timelines we've identified, that those timelines are consistent with the law. And then the next section.
Just one question there.
Yes,
That's
sure.
super helpful. Can you remind us, with the IAD transition, if the intake process will be affected? And I guess that's also a broader question about when that happens, how much is this document going to be required to be updated?
I can at least begin to answer that question. The first is that this document will absolutely need to change depending on the scope of the ID transition. The reality at this juncture is that the ID transition, as it was, I would say, initially imagined, and I've communicated this to council, due to the it's a little more than 37% cut to the agency's budget, is not feasible given the current funding. Now, there are aspects of work where we can grow, and that's certainly our focus, and that this manual is going to certainly encapsulate the growth that is in the immediate foreground. But a transition more broadly will essentially, I would expect, and Chief Smith, please correct me if you think otherwise or if we've discussed otherwise, is that wouldn't necessarily change these processes. It might necessitate additional sections over time, and that those would be flagged certainly by the consultants who are coming in, and I would start with that the basic investigative process should not materially change, as this is about a process that works within the timelines that are currently governing our agency, and I do not foresee changing.
That's correct. The process will remain the same. The question is, there are pieces of the process that were exclusively done on the department side. For example, putting together materials for Skelly hearings, the assignment of Skelly officers, all of that was department side. So exactly how that would be administered going forward, that's something that would certainly occasion the need for update, and also be something that we would have to take into account specifically in relation to timetables going forward.
Oh, Chair,
Go
sorry.
ahead. No, please go ahead.
And as it relates to the intake process, which you specifically asked, no, as it stands, the process would not change. However, the goal is for this to be a living document, so that if we were to come back in 4 months and say the current process isn't working and we need to reshape aspects of our intake process, we need more investigators, we need fewer intake staff, we need more intake staff, we need fewer investigators, that this document will be designed in such a way that those policies can be incorporated to reflect changing agency needs. For example, if there's a charter amendment that says we have a new category of misconduct, we shouldn't need to rewrite the manual. We should have this divided in a way that reflects best practices, so that we can say, okay, the assignment to investigator, steps C, E, G in section 4 and we're going to need a new section for section 7. Those all need to be amended to reflect this change, but that it never means we never need to go back to the drawing board again.
Helpful. I think it's going to be important, to your point, to make sure that, and I don't know if you're probably already doing this, but talking to other investigative agencies across the nation to see if there are best practices or anything we can learn from another agency that's doing this really, really well, the intake aspect of the investigations. And the other piece that I want to just point out, and we can talk about it later, is the data that you're gathering on the front end. What does the data look like? I don't know if you could talk about kind of, what does it look like? And then I think for us, as we think about equity, what are the equity indicators or data points that we should track to help us have better understanding of the work? I think it's something that this ad hoc should think about.
And I'm just jotting both these down because they're both really critical questions to the work that we're doing. The first, when it comes to intake, I can say, having worked with a lot of oversight entities, and I know Chief Smith has the same, well, a different range of experience, but certainly has seen what makes CPRA unique is that the intake process, to my understanding, is different here in Oakland, and that when you look at the amount of work that's done at the intake stage and the scope, you have at our agency at present, you have intake staff watching all the body cam footage that's relevant to the investigation. You have them doing the first point of contact often. You have them gathering all the evidence. Aspects of this make the investigation, once it's assigned to an investigator, much smoother than it would be otherwise. For example, if somebody intakes a case and just sends it to an investigator, there are a lot of document requests, follow-up calls that need to be made that prolong the investigation and the work that the investigator needs to be doing. But it's an either or, and we're certainly factoring in the way in which that's approached here and potential ways to make it more efficient. And I think part of that includes, right now we have a complaint investigator 1, which is a new job spec, which is someone who is functionally performing the investigative role, of course, certain aspects of the intake process, really with an eye on seeing what could be more efficient about the intake role, and with an eye on ensuring that cases can be assigned directly to investigators when necessary. So heavy focus on seeing what's the best way to approach that, and us seeing what's the quickest way to get a case into a healthy state where the evidence is gathered and it can get quickly out to an investigator as needed. So that's the answer to question 1. I don't want to lose that entirely in case there was any feedback regarding that, because now I can go to the data question.
Well, yeah, I think as I heard you speak, I realized this is intake and investigation.
Yes.
I think those are 2 different functions, and are they completed by different roles, right? Or is it one person doing intake and investigation?
So it's 2 different positions as it presently stands. And I think we had it viewed from 2 perspectives. One, we could separate this into 2 sections and have the intake role and have the investigative role. I think from a accessibility perspective, and Chief Smith, correct me if you saw this otherwise, but I saw this as, this is one investigative process, even though it's in intake, in the same way that the IAD in another investigative process, who has the case at a given time, is it going to be so important as to the fact that an investigation is being done? The intake technicians are taking investigative steps from the moment that they get their complaint and they start doing work on the case. And so we didn't want to view one as more or lesser, and we also wanted to present this as one big investigative process as opposed to the intake process versus investigator process. Now, I think each of these sections, when we look at the intake interviews in the intake review, will delineate those responsibilities really clearly. But that was our thinking around this being worth keeping in one category.
Yes, just to emphasize a few of those points. This was a process, and this what we're trying to get is for both the public as well as our staff to view that holistically and to see the case from the point of intake through the investigation as a continuous process. When there is a delineation between intake and investigation in how the process is put forward, my experience has been that the staff will view it that way and the public will view it that way if that delineation is created up front. Whereas very often helping people to understand what happens next after intake is very much facilitated by explaining the process one time all together. so that people can see more naturally the transitions that occur in the investigative process. That's particularly important here in Oakland because there are some parts of this process where a natural thing that could occur is that there is a loss of contact with the complainant. That is a typical result of a situation where intake and investigation are defined separately. However, formally or informally that's done. And that's something I know from previous discussions with Director Muir and others that we were keen to avoid in this document.
And Chair, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I do want to just, when it comes to the cohesiveness of the investigative process, jump back to the staff approach to it. And Chief Smith, you alluded to this, but I think we want to ensure that everyone who is involved in this process internally sees this as a team effort where, and I've seen echoes of, oh, well, I'm done with my part of the process, so this isn't my case anymore. This is not my process. And we want to see ownership collectively from the moment a case enters the agency to the moment I sign off and send it to the chief, or the moment there's a disciplinary decision, and really all the way through the process. So that's the thinking behind this, but we would love your feedback.
I appreciate the thoughts. I think I agree that it's one process, but I think these are two different functions, especially if two different roles are completing the task of intake and investigation. And I actually think that by separating it out as a outsider, it doesn't show that the process is, broken or not smooth. And I think it would provide more clarity from someone, someone who's never done an investigation. If I pick this document up and I want to understand, what the process is for my case to be investigated, I want to know, okay, they bring it in, what happens there? Then when the investigation happens, what is happening in that process, and who should I talk to understand what's going on with my case? So that's my perspective. Commissioner Garcia Acosta, I don't know where do you see those two functions, and is it clear here, or should we think about spreading this out to provide more context and more information?
Always lean towards more clarity. And I think the one part that's unclear with me is where the intake process ends and now transitions into the investigative process, right? And I think for somebody that's going through that process, by separating, I think it'll help them understand clearly what step they're at, and where that line of demarcation is. So that they also know that if there is a misstep in the process, or if they have questions about a particular part of whether it be the intake or the investigative process, they kind of know where to pin that down to a little bit as well. Because one of my questions, before we got to the discussion, was going to actually be where is the official? Is it between step C and D that line is, that you would draw that line between the intake and the investigative process? And so again, I think just by separating that, I would just answer that question from the front end.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that this is certainly an either or juncture, and I would say that we're trying to cultivate a sense that there is no intake process so much as there's the investigative process, and it starts on day one. That's certainly how we're approaching it internally, and I think that if it is useful for the community to see that, we can have conversations about how to approach the layers, but our investigation begins the day that you file your complaint and we determine the jurisdiction, right? And that we know that the intake folks are taking investigative steps by reviewing footage, by gathering it, and by organizing it in a way that is accessible for the next person. But procedurally, the answer to the question you're asking is it's between step B and C. So there is a moment at which you have the intake technician complete their evidence package, their summary of what's going on or what we have at this moment. They submit that to a supervisor, And that, as it presently stands, is the juncture where it sort of leaves intake's hands, unless there is going to be feedback, which sometimes we'll have additional follow-up where just at first glance, hey, you need to call this person back and get this additional information. So there might be that, but once it's assigned to the supervisor and there are no follow-up questions, that's going to be our juncture.
But let me emphasize also that the message and the point that both of you are making, Chair and also Commissioner Garcia Acosta, will be made crystal clear in the document that we produce. There will not be any question as to where that point, where the intake process ends and where the investigative process begins. A lot of that will be in the specificity that's included in the language. These sections, as listed, this is a guide, this is an intro. To the extent there's an additional clarifying section that would be needed, we can provide it. This process is built very much to support that, and we are built to facilitate that, and we are essentially going through everything that we're generating. This is a pretty intensive process right now. So to the extent anyone could take the document that is produced and have those questions that are being raised by the two of you now, we will make sure that what we produce for you will answer those questions up front. And the conversation that we're having both now and going forward will make sure that we're reflecting the input as to what our content is actually showing, both the public and the community and our staff. Because for this particular section, it will end up being the staff that has to use it the most. And I say that in particular because right now in our practice, when there are follow-up questions from complainants and from members of the community with respect to cases, but particularly from complainants, those questions do go to intake staff, and intake staff handles those questions in much the same way that investigators would.
So I'll just add that I can foresee sections A and B being able to be divided into its own category as necessary. But one thing that jumped out, Chair Odaza, just referring back to your initial question of the impact of the IAD transition, certainly as it looked a few months ago, the likelihood was that an expansion would necessitate more investigators and not more intake technicians, which might have an impact on this process, for example, and seeing cases go to investigators perhaps faster, but with a little less work done on the intake side. These are the types of things that will need to be tested and then firmed up. But it does speak to some of the flexibility that I see us needing to have around the distinction between intake and investigation. But your points are very much taken.
Thanks. And I think one of the things that a couple things that are coming to mind is the audience for this document, having clarity as to who is the audience and who should really understand this. And I think it's both the investigators and the staff of CPRA and the community. So someone should be able to pick this up and understand where their case is in the process. And then the other piece too that's coming up is that we've talked a lot about having a diagram to walk the community, an external person through the process. And I wonder if we can ground this manual on that. And even have the image, maybe the image at the top before we even start with the process, have a diagram that shows, where, how to follow their case and use that to guide the document, each of the sections.
Yes, that's something that is an anticipated part of this process. And those diagrams, as per our internal discussion, it is imperative to us to make those diagrams as user-friendly as possible, but also to make them reflective of the content as it exists at the point that the diagram is created. The diagrams, I've been informed by our staff that will actually be involved in creating them. The diagrams, generally speaking, will not take long to create. So we can actually do that. The great news about that is that we can do that at the very end of the process. We don't need to build in any additional time for the diagrams. That's the good news. It's something of a challenge to get everything that you need into that diagram into it, but to maintain the user-friendly nature of it, but we will accomplish it. There will not be any sentences in the diagrams. There will be 3-word phrases. Sometimes there'll be 1 word, so that it is as easy as possible for a person to do exactly what you've described, Madam Chair. Look at the diagram and see where their case is at any given time. Another thing the diagrams will do is they'll facilitate how those questions are answered when investigators and when staff are communicating to complainants who have those questions. Where's my case? They'll be able to say we're in this stage, and they'll have their 2 or 3 word phrase straight from the diagram to refer to them.
Thank you. Can you remind us where we are with the backlog of cases and where we have the most cases currently pending?
So I would say certainly relative to the challenge we were tackling originally, the backlog is largely resolved. We're getting to a point where I haven't done the numbers for the average case time, but it's gone down quite significantly from 363 days to, I think last month was 228, if I remember correctly, for the average time to close a case. And I know I think looking at it separate from sort of the capital T, capital B, the backlog, there are bottlenecks in our processes that I think merit that are out of our control as it presently stands, or that are subject to. Let me give you an example of a delay that may, at least at this moment, seem outside of our control, which is, let's say that the officer's union representative schedules an interview and then cancels, schedules an interview for 10 days from today, and then cancels at the last minute, and then schedules another one for a week later, and then cancels at the last minute. That and that this process continues for, let's say, a month or more. These are the types of things that we are currently assessing for how to make to square with internal timelines, and that there are factors, whether it's somebody being out, whether it's somebody canceling at the last minute, that can seriously impact case timelines. And so that issue is distinct from the prior backlog, but there are other issues, and I will also flag, for example, document requests, that the timely response of the police department to document requests dictates how long our cases are going to take, and that maybe this isn't the exact forum, but shouldn't, there will be instructions regarding how to approach officer interview scheduling and document requests, but that the pitfalls of those processes continue to impact our timelines. So the broader backlog that existed previously, I can say, is largely resolved, but there remain everyday new potential delays in investigations, and sometimes that'll be in our control, and sometimes it'll be a little less out of our control.
That's helpful. And I think to that point, timelines are a critical aspect of these investigations. I think it would be helpful, again, from a community perspective, to have a section on timelines explaining why they're so important. And I think I heard you say or talk about a matrix outlining sort of all of the requirements to move forward with an investigation. I don't know if that's available, but I know that would be super helpful, again, to track a case. And then I think to the conversation around bottlenecks and what's impacting investigations, I mean, I think we have an opportunity to really be creative and to zoom out to understand where we can improve our processes, where we can, you know, make recommendations for additional dollars. So I am definitely going to be curious in hearing from you both, you know, what recommendations do you have for making this process better? And also, you know, where could we borrow best practices from? So, and I think we need to figure out how to lift that up and be explicit about where the challenges are and where we can do better and how we're going to do that through this document.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that merits further clarification is just in terms of that community engagement, and it speaks to perhaps the starting point that Chief Smith and I have on what's the status of your case. As it presently stands, my understanding is that the staff communicates one of three things. Would you like to take a complaint? And they intake the complaint. From then on, it's your investigation is open. And then third, your investigation is closed. And that the intermediary steps may not even be subject to public disclosure. So I think that that's on us to certainly isolate and understand. You know, I know I come from a place where you could type in your case number online and it told you who had been, not who had been interviewed, but it would say on this date, an officer was interviewed. On this date, a document request was made, et cetera, et cetera. California state law does not provide us the same latitude. But I think we should get specific instructions, and I'll bookmark this for us regarding what can be shared, because certainly in its healthiest iteration, we would be able to say exactly where in the investigative process is your case is, but want to understand the limitations in a more precise way, because right now it's your investigation is open or it is not.
Yeah, I don't think that's good enough. And I know there are limitations around what we can say and how much, you know, can be shared. But I really think I certainly heard community folks wanting to have more clarity and insight as to at least just where they are, where the investigation is in the process, not necessarily what are the details of what's going on with your case.
No, I strongly agree. Yeah. So we can certainly circle back on the extent to which other details are legal, because we need to be transparent to the maximum extent the law allows. I know we're getting tight on time here. Might we transition to just quick hits on these latter parts, or if you'd like to prioritize this over the annual report, it's really whatever. We're ready either way.
How many more sections do you need to go through?
I think that there are some general comments that can be made with the remaining sections. Each of the sections from 7 through 10, these are all sections where substantial addition was needed to what was outstanding, meaning that in the discussions that had taken place over time and also in the trainings, there was relatively little provided in the way of detail regarding these sections. So a lot of the introduction of new content will come through these sections. And that's sort of the most important thing to say about each of these. In particular, the section on allegations, there's some significant things that we want staff to know, as well as the public to know, regarding considerations around each of these allegations: forced profiling in custody death, in particular search and seizure, illuminating that discussion as much as we can in a way that's usable for staff and also informative for the public. That's important. And particularly sections 8 and 9 for staff. Interviewing and the closing reports, the reports of investigation. There needs to be more of a step-by-step guide for staff as to how they might engage in the exercises involved in those two elements. So the need for additional content was greatest with those sections, section 7 through section 10. I know that we're running short on time, so I don't want to include a lot of detail there, but happy to answer any questions that the conversation might hold there.
Can you scroll to the bottom? I think we should have a discipline committee here. That's part of the process, right? Or is that embedded in any of these subcategories?
That's embedded in discipline. We can add a section that it focuses exclusively on disciplinary committees, but it's included in the levels of discipline. And we can add a section that says, you know, explicitly what takes place when there is disagreement between the department and CPRA on discipline.
Right. Any other thoughts or questions from you, Commissioner?
Yeah, no, I think this is all straightforward. I'm really looking forward just to kind of seeing the details of the documents, right, and being able to further engage on that end of it. I part of what I'm thinking as well too is, going back to Madam Chair's comment around audience, right? It's clear that this is going to guide the department, right? Guide the employees of the department. And I'm wondering how a document like this, and when we're talking about visuals and things like this, to be able to really further explain in different ways, different methods to the public, so that it's something that's easily digestible. And I'm thinking, once this is complete, sorry to put another task, right? But like, how can this be translated into like a complainant's bill of rights, right? Where it's all kind of synthesized, where it doesn't get into a lot of the technical stuff that maybe the staff needs to know, but really just summarizes the parts of this document that could really be a handbook for them, that goes through the frequently asked questions, through definitions, has the flow charts of these different steps, right? And maybe just being able to pull out key areas of this manual that pertain to the general public and to the community at large, or to a potential complainant, that could then be translated into like a manual or a bill of rights, or something that they know that, hey, this is what I have the right to expect. These are the expectations, these are the timelines, these are definitions that they could actually refer to while they're going through the investigative process with your office. So that would be the only other thought I would have on this.
I really appreciate that, Commissioner, and I think that ultimately we want to have this be accessible and empowering, and framing it as that these are your rights. And I know I speak to some of that in the annual report, and I think there are some things that are maybe more translatable from that document than from this one. But speaking to what is your freedom from retaliation, what is your freedom from unlawful search and seizure, we can refer back to both the Constitution and the City of Oakland rules that ensure that you are protected throughout this process, and that you know what to do if you feel like you are not getting the rights you've been afforded.
One thing I would add to that is that the community engagement process, the community outreach process, results in the generation of exactly those materials. You will end up with condensed versions of some of these sections. You'll end up with, as you described, pieces of different sections that are most immediately relevant to the community being removed and presented as part of a brochure, or in some cases as part of a card as well. Typically what you get in a community outreach as well is a discussion generally of community rights, and a discussion, for instance, that younger members of the community might be able to engage, say, a small card that tells them how to handle situations when they are encountered by police. What kinds of things to do to ensure that they can both get away from that situation without an incident being harmful to themselves or too intrusive upon them, and facilitating anything that they might need to do to report that engagement afterwards. So the community outreach process will very much include generating some materials that do exactly what you've described.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Chief. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Madam Chair, I'd just like to add, this speaks to a conversation that Chief Smith and I have had around just public education opportunities, with a particular eye on sort of know your rights focused work, potentially in Oakland Public Schools. So I think that when we go back to the original conversation around areas in which this ad hoc can form those ideas and crystallize them, certainly want to just put that out there as a point of interest going forward.
Thank you. All right, so let's move through to the next item, the annual report. And at our next meeting, I think we should continue the discussion on where each section is, whether there's any additional feedback, and hopefully start reviewing each section to get the work started.
All right. Would it be best if I shared the draft manual here?
Yep.
Great. Or sorry, draft annual report. Great. Reports. And almost have it loaded here. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great.
And thank you, Natasha. Can you zoom in actually?
Most definitely. We know when it's too far.
A little more. Thank you.
Is that good? Okay.
Yep.
So this is certainly in draft version. Love your feedback regarding the approach, the organization. It's a different, certainly different experience than the manual, as this is our audience is the public. Our audience is engagement with our process. Strictly, this is not an internal document for supervisory purposes by any means, but also I hope that it provides an outline of our processes in a meaningful way, and one that provides a vision for what's occurred and what the future is as well. Would you?
Okay.
Yeah. What would you like? How would you like to approach this, Chair?
Could you just scroll down just to see I'm scanning the table of contents.
So, yeah, just to speak through it, we've got the executive summary, a letter, a mission statement. We've got investigations. We've got the investigative process laid out. Again, really broad strokes for public engagement, but to understand, here's the investigative approach to our work. Here are the various steps that you hit. Here is what happens with adjudication. Not as detailed as you're going to see in the manual, but you've got an outline for how we approach this, and Then you've got the protections that are due to officers. You've got the appeals processes, really in a bigger picture way, laying out what happens with an investigation internally and what happens after it leaves the doors of CPRA, along with a commitment to the NACOL Code of Ethics, a summary of our triage process from August 23 to January 24, staff accomplishments, our work with the commission, challenges and goals for the future, which speaks to really some of the hiring needs that our agency continues to push for. There's a council meeting tomorrow for anyone watching. Hope you can attend to advocate for us getting additional budget. And that's the general arc. We speak to city auditor recommendations as they've been auditing our agency. They first audited the agency in 2020 and continue to come back to us with feedback on our processes. We've got a conversation about data and data management and the issues the agency has faced post ransomware. But I'll stop summarizing for a moment and ask where you'd like to begin, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'm just making a note. I think it would be helpful maybe to start with the table of contents. I think this is great. And I'm also, again, putting the audience hat on. This is for someone who doesn't work for the city to understand what what happened in the CPRA. So I think starting with the accomplishments, the case triage process, I think all of that can be moved up. I think the independent investigations, frankly, threw me off when I first read it. I was a little bit lost as to what that was and why it was there. I think that could be at the end of this document or as an appendix. I think I also saw somewhere on the second page other stuff that I think can be lifted up for folks to get to see and read and understand.
Excellent. And what were those other sections? I'd love
Can
to.
you scroll down?
I think that's the end of
that's
our
it?
table of contents there.
Okay. Well, I think that even starting with who we are, that should be, after after somewhere around the mission statement, really at the top. I think, the public's going to be curious about the role of the police commission. That should be lifted to the top. Then, going through the accomplishments, the triaging process, I think that was huge for us in the last few years. I also wonder if you're talking at all about the IAD transition work and investments on that end and sort of all the things you've been working on with the new space and all of that, like providing more color on what's happened at the CPRA over the last, what is the time frame for this?
1 year.
Over the last year. I mean, I think a lot happened. So we should really lift that up. And I would encourage you, I don't know what the rest of the report looks like. I haven't had an opportunity to review, but pictures and colorful really make this as a community engagement opportunity. Is there a one pager where you can highlight close X number of cases, hired X number of staff, X $1 million budget, just a snapshot for people to, if they just pick one document, they have an opportunity to understand what the CPRA has accomplished over the last year.
Sorry, I'm jotting down notes here, but very valuable. And yeah, we're looking at this. I should stress, this is the raw document that does not have the graphics that we intend to aim for. But so this is just the content with there are a few boxes that are more decorative, but highlight important points. We certainly do have expanding the CPRA's footprint in Oakland. So that speaks to not only the field work that we've continued to do, but the outreach events that we've attended, and speaks to the specific locations where we've been at and the goals to expand going forward. I think that what I've aimed for in this document is to speak to what we've done general goals going forward. And I think that some of this is subject, as I really hammer home in the data and case management, hiring needs, et cetera, is that some of this is subject to budget constraints. But I think it's really important we highlight what we have done, what we can be doing now, and what we really want to do going forward and what's necessary. But the footprint is, I think, pretty well captured here. And if I just pop down to page 16, let's see. Yeah, so expanding CPRA's footprint in Oakland. We talk about the requirement to have a first floor location. We have the DVP satellite location highlighted. But again, I understand it's a lot of raw text and that there'll be more accessibility to come.
Yeah. And I think just to the point around accessibility, making sure that our final report is translated in at least Chinese and Spanish is going to be important. And even thinking about a slide deck, you know, I know this is a lot of good information, but also recognizing not a lot of people are actually going to take the time to read it. Are there other ways that we can get the main points across of this document in other, you know, platforms and avenues? So how complete is this document? Would you say it's ready to go?
I would say that, yeah, pending your feedback, and if it is largely ready to go. I think that as our staff feedback is complete, our legal feedback is complete, well, to the extent it can ever be complete. And I think that, yeah, we just like your take on any individual section. If there's something that you think should be moved around, I certainly appreciate that. If there are details in here you think should be highlighted or expanded on, would love that feedback. That's a great start with just moving those sections around. And so yeah, this hasn't been touched. I don't plan to touch this further except for minor edits as needed. Until I get feedback from you all, if there's further needed on your end.
Side of the readjustment of the sections, I think it's fine. Commissioner Garcia Costa, do you have any additional feedback on that report?
No, I would just echo that feedback. Is just the flow of it and really just starting off highlighting history, role, and going right into accomplishments, challenges, and moving the whole independent investigation process down. Or even just making it an attachment to this initial document. Other than that, yeah, I mean, I think it definitely needs to be not so loaded with information and very straightforward and highlighted. And I understand it's just the text doc, but you know, really looking forward to the visuals that would come along with it, especially as it pertains to the independent investigations. We have strong visuals around that stuff, then we don't really need to spend so much time on that within the body of this document. And really just highlighting, you know, who you are, the importance of it, and even just, you know, the fact that, you know, there was a racial, you know, there was the first sustained allegation, right, of racial discrimination. So I think, you know, things like that where folks could actually see this is something that's working, it's evolving, they could be a part of, ways to get involved, right? I think those things are all important.
Really appreciate that. And yeah, I think if you're ready at this juncture, we can certainly transition to the making this visually enticing phase. Yeah, I think that,
yeah,
making sure that it has a balance. You know, what my hope is to aim for is something that where this is first and foremost valuable to the public, value to the community of Oakland, and also to ensure that it is to some extent valuable academically into the police oversight universe at large, just given the impact of Oakland police oversight nationally, that this is another useful reference document to say, okay, what is the nitty gritty? So including that as reference documents, I like that so that it's there, but it leads with the how can I make this digestible to a member of this community who wants to figure out how police oversight works.
All right, well, I think after making those adjustments, Micah, if you're still with us, if you can work with our chair to add it on the next agenda, And at
Mhm.
least we can start the conversation, even if we need to, roll it over a couple meetings. But I think it's ready to go.
And Madam Chair, I would just ask regarding the mission statement here, it would be helpful for our manual process if we go down and just, whether it's now or later, assess this mission statement, get some feedback as needed, because it is certainly a focal point of or a starting point for a bit of our work.
Yeah. How does this compare to another jurisdiction?
I would say that it more closely parallels as the well, does it compare? I think that you're going to have this roughly parallel. I think that speaking to safeguarding constitutional policing, the commitment to transparency is going to be more community driven here in Oakland, and so you might have more conservative approaches to framing that. But I think that what we want to say first and foremost, and what is really in the substance of the letter that I wrote there, is like, this is about you, who, no matter who you are, if you're in the city, the Constitution protects the following for you. And safeguarding constitutional policing means that you are free from unreasonable search and seizure, you have due process, and the other aspects of the Constitution that where you are afforded those rights. So I particularly like that aspect of it. I think it parallels pretty well with other oversight agencies that might not have as much texture to what they're attempting to describe. I know that Chief Smith, who's been a director at a few other agencies, can perhaps speak to that. But this, to my understanding, is pretty in line with the format of what we want driving, just has a little bit more sauce to it.
Yeah, I'd agree with Director Muir that this communicates the mission as you'd want to convey it. But I can tell you that there are two elements of this. Just I'm looking at previous agencies where I've worked, and saying that it's civilian run, saying that it's community centered. These are big civilian oversight priorities, but these also would be major battles to get these phrases into a mission statement. I can tell you it's refreshing to have the opportunity to fully communicate the mission of the agency this way. But it's definitely kind of a battle-worthy conversation, to say the least.
Thank you. And I'm curious if it's necessary at this point to clarify, the allegations that this agency can investigate, right? Looking at the first sentence, it's an agency that independently investigates allegations of OPD misconduct in, use of force, whatever the categories that they are. Does it make sense for us to be explicit here so that it's clear on the community side or anyone who picks up this document in terms of what type of misconduct this agency investigates?
Absolutely. Chair, I would say that my goal in the mission statement is to keep it broad, and that no one thinks, well, if I
Okay.
wasn't subject to use of force or a false statement, that this agency isn't going to investigate. I think we want our starting point to be any allegation of OPD misconduct is welcome to be filed here. And our position remains that we do have the authority to investigate any allegation of OPD misconduct. Now, we are required by charter to investigate public complaints of force, truthfulness, First Amendment assemblies, death in custody, and racial profiling of any protected class. But I think that even if somebody is stopped and frisked, I want them to think of us as the starting point for where to go, and that in the details, we can talk about what is mandated versus not mandated. But there are instances in which we investigate cases that don't immediately fall within those mandated categories. because we see the public interest at hand. So that's the thinking going behind the approach, but it's an important question.
Okay. One other thought for me around this mission statement is that, or more of a question, has the Department of Race and Equity looked at our mission statement and provided feedback?
I know we've certainly discussed it at length, and I am trying to remember whether we sent them. I know I had an hour-long meeting with Director Flynn specifically about mission statement, and I can make sure that I send it if I have not already, as in this format. I think I've just this document's only been shared with the commission at this juncture, so I will make a note to send it to Director Flynn. But whether it's the mission statement or our internal processes or the data collection, we've been having regular meetings with the Department of Race and Equity to ensure that that's guiding even our budget conversations and the work that's going on as we better articulate the agency's day-to-day operations. So I will definitely send that to them, or I will confirm that I already have.
Sounds good. So I think let's move forward with what's here, unless Commissioner, do you have any thoughts or feedback on the mission statement? No. I think we should move forward with the report as is, and maybe also have a conversation with the full commission. Maybe spend a couple minutes showing the mission statement and asking the question to the full body to see if there's something that maybe we're just not seeing. And also just confirming that the Department of Race and Equity has reviewed it and has provided their thoughts and feedback to make sure the language is equitable.
Most definitely.
All
And
right.
I'll include that in the next agenda for the commission, if that's with your permission.
Yep, let's do it.
And then to the extent there's any vote necessary, or I'll consult with Chair Peterson, but that would be immensely valuable for us.
Great. I think that's all we had on the agenda, unless there's anything else folks want to touch on.
I know Commissioner Jackson Castaigne is not here today. I don't know if she had any additional feedback on the annual report, or if you think that that's something I should reach out to her about. I'd be more than happy to just get any detailed thoughts on that. I would say that one of the defining aspects, and I alluded to this in the prior report out to the commission, is that ransomware has severely impacted our ability to put out data in the way that is reflective of a top-notch civilian oversight entity. And that's discussed at some length in here. And I'm sure that Commissioner Jackson Castaigne, given her background, can maybe give some insight as to what at least would be most valuable to incorporate here. We have some hard numbers, and you hit on the bullet points, Chair, that are going to be meaningful. But the more feedback, the better on that, to see whether we do need to take a timeout and gather anything different. If there's a thought that, hey, we got to make sure this is incorporated, I'd like to know.
Great. That sounds good. Thank you so much. So just let us know if anything changes, or if the chair wants us to take another review before bringing it to the full commission.
Sounds good.
All right, so I know we didn't talk about this, and without the full commissioners present, it's hard to make a decision, but I think one thing that this body needs to think about is the frequency of meetings. Does it make sense to meet monthly, every other month, every 6 weeks? I don't know. But for now, I think let's not schedule another meeting, but really think about, and I'll connect with you, Ricardo and Angela will talk on our end. And I think Mac, if you can connect, figure out what works for your team, and then we can come back and figure out how to move this work forward consistently, because we haven't, for various reasons, but now we have an opportunity to be consistent with this.
Absolutely. And to the I'm certainly prepared to schedule an ad hoc shortly after that deadline if there is interest, but I'll just know that will be available one way or the other. And just want to thank you, Chair, for your work on this. And I know you've continued to drive it forward and been instrumental from what I believe was day one when you were in the first meeting of this ad hoc.
Thank you. All right. Well, that is all. Thank you so much for the time. Have a great evening.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much, everyone.
This has been great.
Bye.
Well, good night, everyone.